The morning mist clung to the Ardennes forest like a shroud, and Staff Sergeant William Bill Henderson knew something was terribly wrong. It was December 15th, 1944, and the silence along the Siegfried Line felt different, too quiet, too deliberate. Henderson pressed his back against the frozen bark of a massive pine tree, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold as he peered through his binoculars at the German positions barely 500 yards away. "Sergeant, you seeing anything?" "Over there?" whispered Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, crawling up beside him through the snow-covered underbrush. The young soldier from Texas had been with the 106th Infantry Division for only 3 months. But Henderson had already grown fond of the kid's unwavering optimism. Henderson lowered his binoculars and shook his head slowly. "That's just it, Rodriguez. I'm not seeing anything. No movement, no smoke from their positions, nothing. It's like they all packed up and went home for Christmas." The forest around them stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of towering evergreens and frozen streams that had become their world for the past 2 weeks. Henderson's unit, part of the 285th Infantry Regiment, had been holding this sector of the front since early December, expecting nothing more than routine patrol duty in what military intelligence had dubbed a quiet sector, according to a report published in Stars and Stripes military newspaper. The Ardennes region had been considered so peaceful that many units used it as a rest area for battle-weary troops recovering from the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen forest. Private Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in the snow. "Maybe they're planning something for Christmas, Sarge. My grandmother always said the Germans love their holidays." Henderson almost smiled at that. Rodriguez had a way of finding hope in the darkest situations, a quality that had kept morale up during their long, cold nights in foxholes that seemed carved from solid ice. But Henderson's instincts, honed through campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, told him something else entirely. The Germans weren't celebrating, they were preparing. "Rodriguez, I want you to head back to Lieutenant Morrison's position," Henderson said, his voice low and urgent. "Tell him I recommend we double the watch tonight. Something doesn't feel right." As Rodriguez began to crawl away through the snow, Henderson turned his attention back to the German lines. The enemy positions looked abandoned, but he knew better. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, beyond the fog, something was stirring. He could feel it in his bones, the same sensation he'd experienced before every major battle he'd survived. The afternoon wore on, with agonizing slowness. Henderson made his rounds, checking on his men scattered in foxholes along a front that stretched for nearly 2 miles. Each soldier he visited wore the same expression, cold, tired, but alert. They were good men, most of them barely old enough to vote, thrust into a war that had already consumed millions of lives across Europe, as darkness began to fall over the Ardennes. Henderson settled into his own foxhole, sharing the cramped space with Corporal James Woody Woodward, a former lumberjack from Oregon who could spot enemy movement better than anyone in the unit. They sat in companionable silence, taking turns on watch, listening to the forest sounds that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats. "Sarge," Woody whispered around midnight. "You hear that?" Henderson strained his ears. At first, there was nothing but the usual sounds of wind through pine needles and the distant howl of wolves. Then he heard it, a low rumbling, like distant thunder, but steady and mechanical. "Tanks," Henderson breathed, his blood turning too. "Ice water." The sound grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable grinding of heavy machinery moving through forest paths. Henderson grabbed his radio, but static filled the airwaves. Communication lines had been cut. In the darkness of December 16th, 1944, the largest German offensive of the war was about to begin, and Henderson's small unit stood. Directly in its path, the first artillery shells began falling at 5:30 in the morning. December 16th, 1944, Henderson was jarred awake by explosions that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Trees splintered and crashed around their positions as German 88mm guns opened up along a front stretching from Monchaux to Echternach. "Rodriguez, Woody, everyone up," Henderson shouted over the deafening barrage. The young private from Texas emerged from his foxhole like a prairie dog, his helmet askew and his eyes wide with terror and adrenaline. The bombardment lasted for 2 hours. The most intense artillery fire Henderson had experienced since the landings at Anzio. When it finally ceased, an eerie silence fell over the forest, broken only by the groaning of damaged trees and the distant cries of wounded men. Henderson's ears rang so badly, he could barely hear his own thoughts. Through the morning mist came the sound that every American soldier in the Ardennes would remember for the rest of their lives: the deep, mechanical growling of German tanks and the rhythmic tramp of thousands of boots on frozen ground. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Adolf Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, had begun. "Panzers," Corporal Woodward yelled, pointing through the smoke and debris. Henderson raised his binoculars and felt his stomach drop. Emerging from the forest like steel monsters were German Tiger tanks, their long guns swiveling toward American positions. Behind them came waves of infantry in white winter camouflage. Moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine, Henderson grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Fox Company. We've got armor moving on our position. Estimate 24 tanks with infantry. Support. Request immediate artillery support," static answered him. The communication lines were still down. Private Rodriguez crawled over to Henderson's position, dragging his Browning automatic rifle through the snow. "Sarge, what do we do? There's got too many of them." Henderson looked at the young soldiers, faced and saw his own fear reflected there. But beneath the terror, he also saw determination. These men had trained for this moment, had prepared to face exactly this situation. Now, it was time to prove that American soldiers could stand against the Wehrmacht's best, as documented in the official U.S. Army history of the Battle of the Bulge. The initial German assault involved over 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks, catching American forces completely by surprise across an 80-mile front. "We hold this position as long as we can," Henderson said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Every minute we delay them gives our boys behind us time to set up better defenses. Rodriguez, you and Woody take the left flank. I'll coordinate with what's left of 2nd Squad." The 1st German infantry reached their perimeter at 10:15 in the morning. Henderson watched through his rifle scope as white-clad figures moved between the trees like ghosts. He waited until they were 50 yards away before giving the signal to open fire. The crack of American M1 Garand rifles echoed through the forest as Henderson's men engaged the enemy. Rodriguez's bar chattered steadily, cutting down German soldiers who exposed themselves for even a moment. But for every German who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. A Tiger tank crashed through the tree line just 30 yards from Henderson's position, its massive gun turning toward their foxholes. Henderson dove for cover as the tank fired, the explosion showering him with dirt and fragments of frozen earth. When he looked up, Corporal Woodward's position had taken a direct hit. "Woody." Henderson scrambled through the snow toward his friend's destroyed foxhole. He found the Oregon lumberjack trapped under a fallen log, blood seeping from a gash across his forehead. "I'm okay, Sarge," Woodward gasped, trying to push the heavy timber off his legs. "Just pinned down. You gotta get the boys out of here." Henderson looked around at what remained of his unit. Of the 32 men who had gone to sleep the night before, he could see only 18 still fighting. The German advance was unstoppable, rolling over American positions like a massive gray tide. "Fall back," Henderson shouted, fighting withdrawal to the secondary positions. As his men began their desperate retreat through the forest, Henderson stayed behind to help free Corporal Woodward. The sound of German voices grew closer, punctuated by the mechanical rumble of more tanks approaching through the trees. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and Henderson's war was about to become very personal by noon on December 16th. Henderson's unit had been pushed back nearly 3 miles through the dense Ardennes forest. What had started as an organized fighting withdrawal had devolved into a desperate flight for survival. German Sturmgeschütz assault guns crashed through the underbrush behind them, their tracks churning up frozen earth and fallen logs as they pursued the retreating Americans. Corporal Woodward limped alongside, Henderson, his left leg badly bruised but still functional. Private Rodriguez had taken shrapnel in his shoulder but refused to abandon his bar, carrying the heavy weapon despite the blood soaking through his field jacket. The survivors of Fox Company moved like wounded animals, instinctively seeking cover in the maze of pine trees and rocky outcroppings. "Sarge, we can't keep running forever," Rodriguez panted, pausing to catch his breath behind a massive boulder. "These boys need medical attention, and we're almost out of ammunition." Anderson knew the private was right. They had maybe 2 clips per man remaining. Then several of the wounded wouldn't last another hour without proper medical care. But surrendering to the Germans wasn't an option. It's not after what they'd heard about SS units operating in the area. Through the trees ahead, Henderson spotted movement. He raised his hand to halt the column and crept forward with his rifle ready. What he saw through a gap in the pine boughs made his blood run cold. German soldiers were setting up a roadblock on the only road leading back to American lines, complete. With a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon and a machine gun nest, Henderson crawled back to his men. "We've got Krauts blocking the road ahead. Looks like a full squad with heavy weapons." Private First Class Michael Irish O'Sullivan, a red-haired soldier from Boston whose family had emigrated from County Cork, spat into the snow. "So what's the plan, Sarge? Can't go forward, can't go back, and can't stay here." Henderson studied the faces of his remaining men. They were cold, hungry, and running on pure adrenaline, but they were still soldiers. "Still Americans? We go around? There's got to be a deer trail or something that leads through these woods." "Woody, you know forests better than any of us. What do you think?" Corporal Woodward studied the terrain with the eye of someone who had spent his life among trees. "Out there," he said, pointing to a barely visible gap between 2 massive pines. "Animals always know the easiest path through rough country. Follow that game trail, and it should parallel the road, but stay hidden in the forest." As reported in Time magazine's coverage of the battle, thousands of American soldiers found themselves cut off behind German lines during the initial days of the offensive, forced to navigate the treacherous Ardennes terrain while avoiding enemy patrols. The survivors of Fox Company began their trek through the wilderness, moving single file along a path that seemed designed for deer rather than soldiers. Henderson took point, followed by the wounded, with Irish O'Sullivan bringing up the rear as their best marksman. The forest around them had taken on an otherworldly quality. Snow-laden branches created a cathedral-like canopy overhead. The silence was broken only by their labored breathing and the distant sound of artillery. 2 hours into their journey, they stumbled upon something that stopped Henderson in his tracks. Through a clearing in the trees, he could see a small Belgian farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney.
More importantly,
he could see American soldiers moving around the building, survivors like themselves, who had managed to escape the German advance. "It looks like we're not the only ones who had the same idea," Woodward whispered. Henderson approached the farmhouse cautiously, his rifle ready, but not aimed directly at the building. As they got closer, he could see that the Americans were from different units, some from the 106th Infantry Division like themselves, others from the 28th Infantry Division, and a few from various support units that had been caught in the German assault, a lieutenant from the 110th Infantry Regiment. His uniform torn and his left arm in a makeshift sling greeted Henderson's group. "Welcome to Hotel Hell," Lieutenant Robert Morrison said with grim humor. "We've got about 40 men holed up here, all trying to figure out how to get back to our own lines." Henderson quickly assessed the situation. The farmhouse was defensible, with good fields of fire in 3 directions. The Belgian family, who owned a 10 elderly couple named Henry and Marie Dubois, had been feeding and caring for the American soldiers despite the obvious danger to themselves. "What's our supply situation?" Henderson asked. "Not good," Morrison replied. "We've got maybe 2 days of ammunition if we're careful, and the medic we have is doing his best, but he's running out of supplies too. The real problem is that we're completely cut off. Every road out of here is crawling with Germans." As night fell on December 16th, Henderson found himself in command of a makeshift unit of American soldiers who had refused to surrender. Outside, they could hear the sound of German vehicles moving along nearby roads, carrying supplies and reinforcements toward the advancing front lines. The Battle of the Bulge was less than 24 hours old, and Henderson was beginning to understand that their survival would depend not just on military training, but on their ability to become something they had never trained to be: guerrillas, fighting behind enemy lines. December 17th. Dawned gray and bitter cold. Henderson woke to the sound of German voices outside the farmhouse, speaking in hushed tones that carried clearly through the thin walls. He grabbed his rifle and crept to the window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. A German patrol was moving through the farmyard, 6 soldiers in winter camouflage examining the tracks their group had left in the snow the previous evening. Henderson held his breath as one of the Germans, an Obergefreiter with a scar across his left cheek, knelt to study the footprints more closely. Henry Dubois, the elderly Belgian farmer, emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of milk, acting as naturally as if enemy soldiers weren't prowling around his property. He nodded politely to the German patrol leader and continued with his morning chores, showing no sign of the 40 American soldiers hidden in his cellar and attic. Henderson watched as the German patrol leader questioned the old farmer in broken French. Henry responded with the perfect mixture of confusion and cooperation, playing the role of a simple countryman who knew nothing about American soldiers. After 10 tense minutes, the patrol moved on, disappearing into the forest toward the main road. "That was too close," whispered Lieutenant Morrison, who had been watching from another window. "We can't stay here much longer. Sooner or later, they're going to search the house." Henderson nodded, but his mind was already working on a different problem. Through his conversations with the other survivors, he had learned that the German advance was even more successful than he had initially realized. Units were reporting German spearheads advancing toward the Meuse River, threatening to cut off thousands of Allied troops and potentially reaching the vital port of Antwerp. Private Rodriguez, his wounded shoulder now properly bandaged by the unit medic, approached Henderson with a grim expression. "Sarge, I've been talking to some of the boys from the 28th Division. They say the Germans overran Clairvaux yesterday. That's where division headquarters was supposed to be." The implications hit Henderson like a physical blow. If Clairvaux had fallen, it meant the entire command structure in their sector was in chaos. They weren't just cut off, they were completely on their own. Corporal Woodward limped over, favoring his injured leg but moving with determination. "Sarge, I've been thinking. We can't stay here, but we can't just wander around the forest either. What if we made ourselves useful?" Henderson raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind, Woody?" "Supply lines," Woodward said, his logger's practical mind working through the problem. "Every army needs supplies, and the Germans are pushing so fast they've got to have long, vulnerable supply lines stretching back through these forests. We hit their convoys, slow them down, make them worry about what's behind them instead of just what's ahead." As documented in the historical records of the Office of Strategic Services, numerous small groups of American soldiers operated behind German lines during the Battle of the Bulge, conducting sabotage operations that significantly disrupted enemy logistics. Lieutenant Morrison overheard the conversation and joined them. "Woodward's right. We've got experienced soldiers from 4 different units here. If we're going to be stuck behind enemy lines, we might as well make the Germans pay for the privilege." Henderson looked around at the men gathered in the farmhouse. They were a mixed group: infantry, artillery, even a few mechanics and cooks who had been caught in the initial assault. But they were all soldiers, and they all understood what was at stake. "All right," Henderson said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made his decision. "We're not running anymore. Become a problem the Germans didn't count on." The first operation took place that very evening. Henderson led a team of 8 men to a crossroads where German supply trucks had been moving regularly throughout the day. They positioned themselves in the forest on both sides of the road. With Corporal Woodward and Private Rodriguez manning a captured German Panzerfaust, they had found abandoned near the farmhouse. At 11:45 that night, the rumble of heavy vehicles announced the approach of a German convoy. Henderson watched through his rifle scope as 3 trucks loaded with ammunition and fuel approached their position. He waited until the lead truck was directly in front of Woodward's position before giving the signal. The Panzerfaust whooshed through the darkness, striking the lead truck and igniting its cargo in a massive fireball that lit up the forest for hundreds of yards. German soldiers poured out of the burning vehicles, shouting orders and firing wildly into the darkness. But Henderson's men were already melting back into the forest, disappearing like ghosts among the pine trees. "That's for Fox Company," Henderson muttered as they made their way back to the farmhouse. The glow of burning German supplies lighting their path through the snow, the war in the Ardennes had become personal. And Henderson's small band of survivors was about to show the Wehrmacht that American soldiers didn't give up, even when surrounded and outnumbered by December 22nd. Henderson's improvised guerrilla unit had become a significant thorn in the side of German operations in their sector of the Ardennes. They had destroyed 6 supply convoys, cut telephone lines, and eliminated 2 small outposts, all while maintaining their base at Henry Dubois's farmhouse. The old Belgian farmer and his wife had proven invaluable allies, providing intelligence about German movements and maintaining the cover story that allowed the Americans to operate undetected, but success came with a price. They had lost 4 men in the operations, including Private O'Sullivan, who had been killed in an ambush that went wrong near the village of Wiltz. The remaining survivors were exhausted, running low on ammunition and beginning to show the strain of living constantly on the edge of discovery. Henderson stood in the farmhouse kitchen, studying a hand-drawn map that showed German positions based on their reconnaissance over the past week. The intelligence they had gathered painted a disturbing picture. The German advance had penetrated much deeper into Allied lines than anyone had initially realized, with spearheads now within 30 miles of the Meuse River. "Sarge, Private," Rodriguez said, approaching with the careful movements of a man whose shoulder wound was still healing. "The boys are starting to ask questions about Christmas. I know it sounds crazy, given our situation, but morale is getting pretty low." Henderson looked at the young soldier from Texas and realized that Rodriguez was right. It was December 22nd, 1944, and these men were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by enemies with no idea if they would live to see another day. The least he could do was acknowledge the holiday that had always meant so much to American soldiers far from home. Marie Dubois, the farmer's wife, had been listening to their conversation. Despite speaking little English, she had developed a remarkable ability to understand what the Americans needed. She disappeared into the cellar and returned with a small pine branch, which she placed on the kitchen table like a miniature Christmas tree. "Pour les soldats américains," she said softly, her weathered hands arranging the branch with the same care she might have given to decorating a cathedral altar. That evening, snow began to fall outside the farmhouse windows. Henderson's men gathered around their makeshift Christmas tree. Corporal Woodward had fashioned small ornaments from spent shell casings, and someone had found a candle to place at the top of the branch. It wasn't much, but in the context of their desperate situation, it felt like a miracle. According to reports published in the London Times, the siege of Bastogne reached its most critical point on December 22nd, when German forces completely surrounded the vital crossroads town and demanded its surrender. "I know this isn't exactly how any of us planned to spend Christmas," Henderson said, addressing the group of survivors who had become his extended family over the past week. "But I want you all to know something. You men have shown courage that would make your families proud. You've proven that American soldiers don't quit no matter what the odds." Private Rodriguez stood up, wincing slightly from his shoulder wound. "Sarge, if I may, I'd like to say something." Henderson nodded, and Rodriguez continued. "My grandmother used to tell me that Christmas wasn't about where you were, but about who you were with. Looking around this room, I can't think of any men I'd rather be spending Christmas with." The sentiment was echoed by murmurs of agreement from the other soldiers. These men had been forged into a brotherhood by shared danger and mutual dependence. They had watched each other's backs, shared their last rations, and risked their lives for one another without hesitation. The quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the road outside. Henderson immediately doused the candle and motioned for silence. Through the shuttered windows, they could see the headlights of German vehicles, more than they had ever seen in one convoy, Henry. Dubois peered through a crack in the shutters and turned to Henderson with a worried expression. "Beaucoup Allemands," he whispered. "Many Germans." Henderson crept to the window and felt his blood run cold.
WWII convoy was a full company of German infantry with armored support.
And they were stopping directly in front of the farmhouse. The jig was up. "Everyone to positions," Henderson whispered urgently. "Looks like we're about to have some uninvited guests for Christmas dinner." As German soldiers began surrounding the farmhouse, Henderson realized that their week of successful guerrilla operations had finally caught up with them. Someone had talked, or maybe the Germans had simply put together enough clues to track them down. Either way, they were about to face their biggest fight yet. There was nowhere to run. The war had found them on Christmas Eve, and Henderson's small band of survivors was about to discover whether their improvised family of soldiers could survive one final test. Outside, German voices were shouting orders. The metallic click of weapons being readied echoed through the cold night air. Henderson checked his rifle and looked around at his these soldiers who had become brothers in the crucible of the Ardennes forest. "Merry Christmas, boys," he said grimly. "Looks like Santa's bringing us a fight." The German assault began at dawn on December 23rd, with a devastating mortar barrage that shattered the farmhouse windows and set the barn ablaze. Henderson and his men had spent the night preparing defensive positions throughout the building, turning Henry Dubois's home into a fortress that would extract a heavy price from their attackers. "Rodriguez, take 3 men and cover the back door," Henderson shouted over the exploding shells. "Woody, you and the boys from the 28th, get upstairs and give us covering fire from those windows. Everyone else, ground floor positions." The old Belgian farmer and his wife had refused to abandon their home, instead helping the Americans prepare for the siege. Henry had shown them secret passages between the cellar and the upper floors that his grandfather had built during the Franco-Prussian War. While Marie had prepared bandages and gathered every medical supply in the house, when the mortar fire ceased, Henderson knew the infantry assault would begin within minutes. Through the smoke and debris, he could see German soldiers in white winter camouflage advancing across the open ground toward the farmhouse. Behind them came the ominous silhouette of a German tank, its long gun traversing toward their position. "Here they come," Corporal Woodward yelled from the second floor. His rifle cracked sharply. Henderson saw one of the advancing Germans spin and fall into the snow. The battle for the farmhouse became a desperate, close-quarters fight that raged for over 2 hours. German soldiers reached the walls of the building only to be driven back by concentrated American fire. Henderson moved from position to position, encouraging his men and coordinating their defense with the tactical skill that had kept them alive for the past week. Private Rodriguez, despite his wounded shoulder, proved to be a one-man army with his Browning automatic rifle. From his position covering the back entrance, he cut down wave after wave of German attackers, his steady fire creating a zone of death that no enemy soldier could cross. "Panzer!" someone yelled, and Henderson turned to see the German tank grinding toward the front of the house, its massive gun aimed directly at their main defensive position. Henderson grabbed the last Panzerfaust they had, captured and ran toward the front window. As the tank's gun began to elevate, he took careful aim and fired. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the tank's right track, immobilizing the vehicle but not destroying it. The tank's gun swiveled toward Henderson's position. Everyone down. Henderson dove for cover just as the tank fired. The explosion blew out the entire front wall of the farmhouse, filling the air with debris and smoke. When Henderson looked up, he saw German infantry pouring through the breach. The fight became hand-to-hand combat as German soldiers entered the building. Henderson drew his pistol and fought alongside his men in the narrow hallways and rooms of the farmhouse. The sound of gunfire, shouting, and breaking furniture created a cacophony of violence that seemed to go on forever, as documented in Stars and Stripes newspaper coverage. Small unit actions like this one occurred throughout the Ardennes offensive, with isolated groups of American soldiers conducting desperate last stands against overwhelming German forces, just when it seemed that Henderson's position would be overrun. The unexpected sound of American voices shouting outside changed everything. Through the smoke and chaos, Henderson heard the distinctive bark of American Thompson submachine guns and the deeper crack of M1 Garand rifles. "Cavalry's here," Woodward yelled from upstairs, his voice filled with excitement and relief. "Henderson, fought his way to what remained of the front window, and saw the most beautiful sight of his military career, American soldiers advancing across the snow-covered field, driving the German attackers back toward the forest. The distinctive patches on their helmets identified them as men from the 82nd Airborne Division, paratroopers who had been rushed to the Ardennes to help contain the German breakthrough. The German attack faltered and then collapsed as the paratroopers hit their rear positions. Within 30 minutes, the farmyard was secure, and German prisoners were being marched away under guard. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwell of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment approached the ruined farmhouse, stepping carefully over the debris and bodies scattered around the building. He found Henderson sitting on what remained of the front steps, bandaging a shrapnel wound on his arm. "Sergeant Henderson," Colonel asked. "I'm Colonel Hartwell. We've been looking for you and your men for the past 3 days." Henderson looked up at the paratrooper officer with confusion. "Sir, that's right, Sergeant. Intelligence has been tracking your operations behind enemy lines. High Command wants to debrief you on everything you've learned about German positions and supply routes. Turns out your little guerrilla war has provided some of the best intelligence we've received about enemy operations in this sector." Henderson looked around at the survivors of his improvised unit. Rodriguez, with his wounded shoulder, Woodward, limping but still standing, and the handful of other soldiers who had somehow made it through the week-long ordeal. They had started as stragglers from a broken unit and had become something much more important. "How many of your men are operational, Sergeant?" Colonel Hartwell asked. Henderson did a quick count. Of the 40 men who had gathered at the farmhouse, 23 had survived the final battle. They were wounded, exhausted, and running on empty, but they were alive. 23 effective, sir," Henderson reported, ready for whatever comes next. January 15th, 1945, marked exactly 1 month since the German offensive had shattered the quiet of the Ardennes forest. Henderson stood in the command post of the 82nd Airborne Division, studying intelligence maps. That showed the complete collapse of Hitler's desperate gamble. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat back toward the German border. Colonel Hartwell approached Henderson with a folder containing official documents and a small wooden box. "Sergeant, I have some news for you and your men. First, you've all been recommended for the Bronze Star for your actions behind enemy lines. The intelligence you gathered about German supply routes and positions was instrumental in planning our counteroffensive." Henderson accepted the commendation with the quiet dignity that had carried him through the war. More important to him was the knowledge that his men, the survivors of Fox, Company, and the mixed group of soldiers who had fought alongside him, were finally safe behind American lines. Private Rodriguez, his arm now in a proper sling, but his spirits high, approached. With Corporal Woodward and several other survivors, "Sarge, word is that we're being transferred back to a rest area in England. Hot food, clean beds, and no Germans shooting at us." Henderson smiled at the young soldier from Texas who had grown up considerably during their week in the forest. "Sounds good, Rodriguez? You've earned it." The cost of the Battle of the Bulge had been enormous. American casualties totaled over 80,000 men, making it one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. military history. But the German losses had been even more catastrophic. Hitler's last reserve had been shattered, and the road to Berlin was now open to the advancing Allied armies. Henry and Marie Dubois had also survived the final battle at their farmhouse, though their home was now a ruin. The Belgian government would later award them medals for their assistance to Allied forces, and American soldiers contributed money to help rebuild their farm. The elderly couple had proven that courage came in many forms, and their quiet heroism had saved dozens of American lives. As reported in the New York Times coverage of the battle's aftermath, the successful defense of key positions like Bastogne and the heroic actions of small units throughout the Ardennes had demonstrated the resilience and fighting spirit of the American soldier. Henderson walked through the temporary barracks where his men were recovering from their ordeal. They were a different group than the soldiers who had gone to sleep in their foxholes on December 15th. The experience of fighting behind enemy lines, of depending entirely on each other for survival, had forged them into something stronger. Then a military unit, they had become a family. You know what I keep thinking about, Sarge? Rodriguez said as Henderson approached his bunk. That Christmas Eve in the farmhouse, with Marie's little pine branch and Woody's shell casing ornaments. Sounds crazy, but it might have been the best Christmas I ever had. Henderson understood exactly what the young private meant. In the midst of war, surrounded by death and danger, they had discovered something precious, the bonds of brotherhood that could overcome any adversity. The men who had fought in the Ardennes would carry those bonds with them for the rest of their lives. Corporal Woodward joined the conversation. Walking without his crutches for the first time since the initial German assault, got a letter. From my wife back in Oregon. She wants to know when I'm coming home. I told her I'd be there as soon as we finished the job. The job was nearly finished. German resistance was crumbling on all fronts, and everyone knew the war in Europe would be over within months. But for Henderson and his men, the most important victory had already been won. They had survived the test of the Ardennes forest and proven to themselves and each other that American soldiers would never quit, no matter what the odds. As Henderson prepared for sleep in his first warm bed in over a month, he thought about the men they had lost and the men they had saved. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as Hitler's last gamble. It's a desperate offensive that had ultimately hastened Germany's defeat. But for Henderson, it would always be remembered as the time when a group of strangers became brothers, when ordinary soldiers accomplished extraordinary things, and when the forests of Belgium witnessed the kind of courage that defines a nation's character. The snow was still falling outside the barracks windows, but it no longer seemed threatening. It was just snow, beautiful and peaceful, covering the scars of battle and promising that spring would eventually come to the Ardennes forest. The war would go on for a few more months. But for Staff Sergeant William Henderson and the survivors of Fox Company, the most important battle of their lives was over. They had faced the worst that war could offer and had emerged not just as survivors, but as victors in the truest sense of the word, in the quiet of the barracks. Henderson could hear the gentle breathing of his sleeping soldiers' men who had proven that the American spirit could never be conquered, no matter how dark the forest or how cold the snow.